Hi, welcome back to JaffeWoodwinds.com. Today, in our continuing Woodwind Legacy series of video interviews, I'm going to be spending this hour with an old friend, colleague, one of the greatest jazz tenor players in the world, who's been active really for over 40 years now and producing so many great albums as a leader, as a sideman, also as an educator, creating over 7 books, some of which are directly behind me. And we're going to get a little bit of insight into his life, his career, and how he approaches the creative aspect of jazz improvisation. I'm pleased to spend this afternoon with my friend Walt Weiskopf. Walt, thank you for taking the time to do this afternoon, and I hope it'll be worthwhile. I'm sure it will be.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, great. And let's just jump right in and talk a little bit about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, and how you got into music.
I grew up in Syracuse, New York, outside Syracuse, North Carolina. That was the big city. I was outside in the idyllic suburbs. And I had the real good fortune to take advantage of a very good school music program. Of course, at the time, I didn't really think much about it. That's just what it was. I was offered the opportunity to play an instrument in the 4th grade, which I did. I had played piano when I was 5, but it just didn't take. I was just too immature and knuckleheaded, and I quit. My dad is a terrific pianist, was and still is, and he offered me this opportunity, and it didn't work. So by the time
I just want to interject that you also have a brother who's a pretty good pianist too.
Yeah, ironically, when I quit the piano, my dad turned to my brother and said, "Would you like piano lessons?" And at 3.5 years old, he said, "Yes, I would." So there you go. That kind of explains why he's a great piano player and I'm not.
Right. And Walt's brother, younger brother, is Joel Weiskopf. Great jazz player.
Terrific jazz pianist, and also an old colleague of yours, of course. Yes. But when I was in the 4th grade, I was 9 years old, and I guess by that time I was a little bit more able to concentrate for short periods of time, and I played the clarinet. That was my choice, probably because my kids across the street also chose the clarinet, and I did well, and I wanted to keep going, and I guess it was just fairly natural. I had very, very good instruction at that age, particularly because our director at the time was really a terrific guy as far as taking the time to tailor the program to who was in the program, which at the time he didn't have anything like the instrumentation for a standard jazz ensemble, but he would write charts just for us. And he did that. And even though I didn't play the saxophone, I played the clarinet, I was able to participate, and I just loved it. I was totally hooked and began to try and angle my parents to get me a saxophone, which they finally decided to relent in the 8th grade. And in the 8th grade, I began to play saxophone more in earnest and still play the clarinet, but I had terrific opportunities in junior high and high school to participate in organized jazz ensemble. And high school, we had all the current charts that we heard on record by the bands that were performing, Maynard Ferguson and Buddy Rich and Stan Kenton. Stan Kenton, I used to have a terrific company called Creative World, and my band director at the time procured all these charts, and we had all these professional level charts, and I'm sure made a mess of them, but it was really wonderful experience for young folks like us to be able to look at those notes and try and understand what it took to really perform on that level. So that was really great preparation for me. I went to college at the Eastman School of Music, which was only 90 miles away from where I grew up. It seemed a natural fit, and it was a terrific program. Of course, I really had no interest in anything but jazz, but I was very, very fortunate to have my immaturity tempered somewhat, and I had to be a classical saxophone major. And in so doing, I really had to learn the instrument properly. I've always said on hindsight that probably the pressure of the marketplace gradually forced all these programs to kind of dumb down their primary instrumental training and let people major in jazz when they really weren't ready for it, and which is what I would have done if I'd had the opportunity. But fortunately, I did not have that opportunity. I had to be a classical major. But boy, I look back on that and feel very fortunate because I had to learn the instrument properly.
And was Ray Ricker your teacher there at
East? He was. Yeah, and when I think about how young he was at that time, it's hysterical. He must have been about, I guess, in his early 30s when I was his student in 1977, 78, 79.
Right, but he was an experienced player. I know a little bit about Ray's background, that he had jobbing experience, and I think he even...
Oh, sure, yeah.
Did he also go to France and study with Marcel Mule for a little bit of time?
You might be right about
have that in the back of my head.
You might be right about that. You might be right. I should know that. Edit this part out.
Okay, but that's an interesting observations you've made about how programs have sort of segregated these different studies of music, especially for saxophonists. And now you're either or. You're either a classical sax major or a jazz saxophone major. But the idea is that you really have to study your instrument as well as the music, that whatever music that you are looking to, spend your life with. But your instrument has to be a part of that, and it's sometimes neglected in some of the programs out there.
I think it's sadly often been neglected, certainly in my experience teaching jazz majors.
Right.
You'll have to gently explain to them that without mastery of your instruments, you cannot really pursue jazz playing. It's too much to try and do at the same time. You have to center your energies. There has to be at least formative instrumental training. If it's going to be in conjunction with work on jazz, I suppose that could work, but it's pretty rare that a student is that focused that they can do both those things at once.
Especially as undergraduates and beginning college, with all that entails as an undergrad. But I also found it fascinating, once again, that the early instruction that you got in school was so important and made such an impression on you. I'm trying to think back to an artist that I've interviewed in this series who didn't have that same experience, where the school music programs were so vital, and which makes it even clearer for us how much it's important to maintain those programs.
No question.
If we're going to give people a chance at finding their talents.
No question.
So Eastman obviously is one of the top conservatories in this country, and certainly renowned for its jazz programs and commercial programs and classical. I mean, it really covers a full gamut of music, and always has. And shortly after you graduated, or immediately, I mean, you ended up going into the Buddy Rich Band, and you were quite young.
I was about a year intervening. I had it in my head, I guess, that I was going to just move to New York, which I did shortly after I finished school. I finished in the spring of 80, and by the fall of 80, I just moved down ended up in Brooklyn, New York. Really had zero idea what I was doing there, but I managed to find some places to play, some jam sessions, and at the time I didn't even own a tenor. I just showed up with my alto, and I learned in a hurry how far behind I was, but nothing like being in that situation to get you progressing in a hurry. And so I did know how to practice, and I got the opportunity to join the Buddy Rich Band the following spring after I moved. Right. And to this day, I don't know how I hung on. I really had virtually no professional experience, not on that level anyway, but I had enough of an education to be able to hang on. And I guess at the time I was able to learn fast enough.
Right. Well, I have two questions based on what you've said. First, and I didn't realize this, you played alto sax throughout college.
I did. Of course, at that time, we didn't have all the saxophones. We just would play if there was a need for a tenor and the school had a tenor, we could use the school tenor.
I see.
But I didn't get a tenor until I was in New York, and I got a tip actually that Ralph Lama, who was in that chair at the time, might want to move on. And I decided, geez, if this comes my way, I really want to be ready. So I went ahead, I bought a tenor. And lo and behold, that was the tenor that took me onto the band. And I did play that instrument until I got off, and then I got a different horn. It wasn't the greatest instrument, but I guess it got me going.
But you joined Buddy Rich's band with very limited experience as a tenor player, basically.
Zero experience, literally zero experience.
Well, what comes to mind immediately is the situation with Gary Smolian, who was a great alto player, and I knew him on Long Island as that, and he joined Woody's band and had to play baritone. Isn't that's phenomenal? But a great story in that vein too. But what I do know about you, and what I wanted to bring out later in the interview, but I think it's pertinent now, is that you are a very conscientious person. You take care of business 100%. You're very focused on what you're doing, and if there's a timetable or something that has to be done, you always get it done. You're always prepared, you're always on time. So those qualities, I think, which are essential, I think, for any professional musician. But here, coming into a band, playing a chair that and an instrument that you're not as familiar with as, let's say, the alto was for those years in college, yet you took it upon yourself to use this time to learn and to delve into things and take care of business. And I no doubt your approach to taking care of business and practicing and being responsible was noticed, I'm sure, and led to you becoming the tenor player that you have become.
I suppose. It's funny, when you have a certain aspect of your personality, you don't maybe recognize it as being a valuable thing. But I remember lamenting to Roland Vasquez, one of the first guys I worked with in New York in the early 80s, that I didn't feel that I was a good businessman. And he shot right back and he said, "You're a good businessman because you show up on time, you're prepared, you're not high or drunk." And I'm paraphrasing, of course. I don't remember what he said exactly, but you mentioned something else that I know you'll want to ask me about later on, but has to do with ballad playing. And Roland Vasquez was the first person who told me that I was a great ballad player. And that never really occurred to me. It just seemed to be part of what you do in music. But I think it is valuable to be able to step back from yourself and realize what you do have to offer. And I really do value my propensity for organization. I still to this day, I drive my wife crazy because I hate to be late. I can't stand to be late, even for a social occasion. It just drives me crazy. And I suppose that started with being on the Buddy Rich band, where if you were late, the bus would just leave. So fortunately, that only happened to me one time. But as you can see, it made an impression.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to the next question. You're a veteran of some of the better big bands throughout the last, at least the last half century. Buddy Rich Band, the Toshiko Tabakin Big Band, and now, and more recent years, the John Fetchak New York Big Band. What would you say in addition to learning about being responsible and being on time, did you feel was beneficial to you in playing big band, in big bands and big band music for your career?
I think the big thing, and again, it's not really that I understood this as I was coming up, but is to be able to subordinate, which is so key and important when you are working for somebody else, and really even working for yourself, is to understand what role your sound has in the section. And when I was in college, I was playing lead alto in whatever, I suppose it was the third band at the time, and I think I was subbing because I was still a freshman, and I was just having a ball. And Ray Ricker, who was in front of me, he said, "Walt, you cannot phrase like that. It's just way, way out of proportion." And I got this lesson from different people at different times. Lawrence Feldman also, I mean, by that time, of course, I was a colleague of Lawrence's, but we would commiserate about how certain of our colleagues did not understand that to overinflect really is not good business. It's just not appropriate. And I think I did learn that at a fairly young age, so that when you're playing in a section, you cannot elevate your own interpretation or ego beyond a real baseline. You are part of a team, and nobody's really interested in your concept. You are just supposed to play the part. And I sat next to a lot of, I mean, you included, I mean, obviously, people who are way, way far ahead of me, certainly on other instruments, particularly the flute. And that was big education for me, is that the primary objective when you're working for somebody else is to play when called upon to play. So if there's a beat of rest and a dotted half note, nobody really cares if it's a beautiful sound, if it's late on two. Their job is to play the note in relative good intonation with a relatively good sound, clear and concise. That's really all it is. And I think it took me a little bit of time on a professional level to get that. But I had a lot of good formative education, particularly on the Buddy Rich Band, about what it was to subordinate.
Very true. And those comments that you made with regard to your big band experience certainly transfer over to any music and any type of ensemble.
Absolutely.
Playing in a 80-piece orchestra, 16-piece big band, or 5-piece combo. I mean, there's always that where you're part of the group, you're a solo, you're back into the group. You may not have solos in every tune. In a big band, you might have one solo a night, or maybe not even one, but you are part of the group, and you can
indulge yourself. I used to have a ball playing with Frank Sinatra because the parts were so much fun to play. But once I understood what the job is to use your skill and use the sound that you have to enhance the product, not to be heard over the collective sound of the ensemble. You're supposed to enhance the ensemble. And I really grew to love that part of it. The other thing, being a soloist, that's a particular facet, a particular skill that fortunately I was able to develop. But even when I'm leading my own band, I think a lot about tipping over into overplaying and overinflecting. And I think I thought at this stage I can usually edit myself just because I have so much experience doing it. But if I hear myself back and I've overinflected, usually ends up being out of tune, and I don't want to use it. I mean, this happens. We're all human, but there's a certain tolerance for intonation, and inflection is the enemy of intonation. Got to be very careful when you
Yeah.
get into that. You know, for a lot of different players, they didn't have the opportunities that we had growing up, learning how to play in tune properly. But we certainly came up at the right time as far as having the experience playing alongside other sidemen, other colleagues, and I learned so much from playing with my colleagues. You know, playing with guys like you, Chuck Wilson, people who've had a lot of section experience.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely a product of the big bands. I mean, even now, when I play with Steely Dan, I take that experience directly from playing with big bands into enhancing the section.
Interesting. And that's in a 4 or 5 piece horn?
Yeah, four horns.
Oh, yeah.
But we're all in the same school of understanding that nobody's really interested in any of the horn players back there. The horn players are there to create a sound uniformly.
Right. All right. So now, you joined Buddy Rich roughly around 21 or so.
21 years old.
And how many years did you hang with Buddy Rich?
2 years.
2 years. Bravo. That's an achievement. Not everybody can be Steve Marcus.
No one would want to be. It was a pretty high stress job, but I knew when it was time to move on. I really wanted to prove to myself that I could sustain myself in New York. As a matter of fact, right after I got off, I had an opportunity to join the Woody Herman Band, and maybe I should have taken them up on that. But at that time, I wanted to stay put and see how I was going to stay in New York.
Right. Well, how when you got back to town, how did you survive at that point? How did you start building the career that you had in New York?
Well, essentially, I didn't. I took a day job. I worked during the day for many years, and I had to juggle that with oftentimes gigs at night, oftentimes not getting really any practicing done. But I needed money, and that's what I did. Unfortunately, I had enough skill set to survive doing office work and whatever I was called upon to do. Put on a suit and tie. At that time, they still wore suits and ties.
Yeah.
And I was able to survive. And I mean, it felt good to use whatever resourcefulness I had. But I got frustrated, obviously, after several years. I needed to find a way. Luckily, at that point, I was able to transition into, I had enough gigs and various and sundry stuff to sustain myself. But it wasn't until, I joined the Toshiko Akiyoshi Lutabakan band when I was 23, but even though we had great opportunities, we did substantial amount of work. I mean, it was not a living.
Right.
So I still, when I was idle, I had to work during the day.
Right. So, and I think this is important for certainly the younger folks listening in, because coming out of college today, especially now in pandemic times, and the music business is slow to recover, and it will take a while to recover. But even in normal times, coming out of college, with the way the industry has changed over the last 30 years or so, dramatically, it's hard to just jump into earning enough money, having enough gigs to survive, and really, pay for yourself. And so I think that's a great example that even 40 years ago, let's say, you took it upon yourself to make sure you earned enough money to put a roof over your head and food and take care of the basic necessities at the same time as looking for gigs that, because you're not going to be getting $100,000 a year gig coming right out of school does not mean that the world is over and that your schooling was for nothing, that it takes time for everyone.
Yeah, being an artist obviously is not the average career, but ironically, I think that in more and more career paths and walks of life, people do have to learn how to be creative and not rely on just a conventional job, let's say, but to people are working more as for themselves, working from home. So for me, that was just part of the fabric of what I had to do. I didn't stop doing that until probably I was 26 or 27, maybe even 28 years old. I still had a couple of connections that I was able to tap into. If I needed money, I could go to work. But at a certain point, obviously, I just had to cut that cord. It wasn't like I necessarily was ready to do it, but I certainly I was ready to do it emotionally, but financially it was a different story. So
Sure.
not that it's easy, but being an artist is not supposed to be easy. If you're
Right.
looking for that, you're not in the wrong line of work.
Right. One of the things about your background, which I know that has allowed you to survive in New York for as many years, and and make some good bread with benefits, is that you worked a good amount of commercial gigs for a number of years.
I certainly did. I mean, to be ready to do that, I was so immature when I was first in New York. I had no idea how to play a job like that. I mean, really did. It took me years before I understood how to play a Broadway show.
Right, but
I had a lot of false
you had a very good clarinet background, having had clarinet.
That was fortunate.
And saxophone at Eastman. I know you're a terrific sight reader. And we talked about the preparation. So the idea of having other instruments besides your primary instrument, especially as a jazz artist, proved very helpful for you in prolonging your stay in New York and your career, and allowing you to develop so that you had the time to work on your jazz in the off hours as well.
Yeah, certainly was an ace in the hole for me. And again, I didn't plan it that way, but playing the clarinet at that level, I didn't realize what an asset that was until I was in that line of work and saw other primary saxophone players trying to play the clarinet, and realized how difficult it was to make that switch. I could certainly relate, because for me, the flute was the tough thing for me to grow into. I mean, I eventually became a capable flute player, but it certainly wasn't my weakest double. But it's the skill on the instrument. But I also didn't understand how to properly respect that kind of work until I grew to be older.
Right. And just as an aside, you were more than just capable on the clarinet. We did a show together, I think it was the late 90s, somewhere, called Fosse, in which you ended up playing the Benny Goodman solo on stage for about a year or so.
More than a year.
Yeah, that was a very stressful thing to go.
Until I had a nervous breakdown.
Exactly. Well, at the end of the show, after having played the pit for 2+ hours, they go up on stage and play the entire Benny Sing 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 solo by memory, ending up on a triple high B on clarinet. That is not something anyone would want to do, let alone a doubler and someone who still was creating jazz in the off hours. So I mean, it obviously did pay a great deal of.
It did. I value that skill a lot.
Yeah, and those are the things that get your name around in different circles. There's a circle of dealing with club owners and promoters for jazz, and there's a circle of dealing with contractors and commercial music and personnel managers and classical music, whatever it is. But that one can be flexible and play numerous styles of music, even on numerous instruments, is a win-win. So again, for the many jazz sax players I know that'll be watching this, it's not a bad thing to play other instruments. Look, we know Eddie Daniels is a great jazz clarinetist, but his first instrument was saxophone, and anyone who remembers Eddie from playing with Thad and Mel knows how great he was. Phil Woods was a clarinet major at Juilliard and played beautiful jazz clarinet. Gary Foster. And believe it or not, as we now know more from the Michael Brecker biography that came out recently, but I remember Randy telling me Michael's first woodwind was clarinet, which he didn't really like. But I am still convinced that having played that for a year or two as a young fellow, the focus in getting a sound, the control of the fingers, and must have had some positive relation to Mike's
Totally
phenomenal.
You can almost tell a saxophone player who's had clarinet background just from the way they blow the instrument.
Yes, and also
you have to moderate that. You have to
minimal
adjust.
finger motion.
Yeah,
yeah. I remember being at a club once with Phil Woods, watching him play in the '80s, and it was just I happened to get the first table right up close, and I could hardly see his fingers moving. It was absolutely astonishing. And of course, he also carried a cigarette in between the third and fourth fingers while he was doing it, just to rub it in. But I mean, yeah, I think there is something there. So on many levels, it's I think helpful if one looks at it that way to be able to play additional instruments, especially that have a cross relationship with the saxophone. So now you're in New York, you're earning a living, you're surviving, you're playing other instruments, you're doing other gigs. How did your solo career take off? What was the impetus for that and the opportunities that presented themselves to allow you to build your solo career?
Well, that was always my primary goal, even if I didn't understand exactly what it was I was doing. But from my early 20s, I was writing music for myself to play. And I got my first real opportunity to record as a leader when I was 29 for a very small label. And at that time, I really wasn't even up to playing a Broadway show on a professional level. That was something that I was trying to do I was trying to grow in these different fields kind of in tandem, which is a difficult thing to do, obviously. But I recorded as a leader for the first time in 1989, or at least it came out in 89, maybe it was 88. At that time, I also had chosen to go back to get a master's degree on the clarinet because I felt that I really wasn't doing enough as a musician professionally. I decided that I should do something constructive, and all that stuff kind of was happening at the same time. So I went to Queens College and did a master's degree on clarinet. Right around that time was when I got the opportunity to record as a leader on the saxophone. So I was wearing some different hats, certainly.
Yes.
And I didn't really, I mean, I was hanging in there, but I did not really get steady commercial work playing Broadway shows until several years after that.
Right. Right. Well, but again, here your organizational abilities come into fore here. Going for a master's at Queens on clarinet, doing jazz gigs, having your first solo project, getting accustomed to what commercial gig requirements are, all of that coming together at once. One can't do that if one doesn't know how to really organize themselves and have a clear focus.
I think I was able to produce on a certain level. The work that I did as a graduate student was really in a lot of ways kind of lazy work because I really just wanted to play. I did not want to write papers. I did not want to study music history, but I was able to play. That's what I was good at. And on the strength of my playing, I managed to sneak through and get this degree, but I probably wasn't perfectly suited for that. But it really helped me because I had enough background on the clarinet and I really enjoyed that process of playing real chamber music and real orchestral music on more of a level, and that propelled me to a certain level of being able to gravitate toward professional work in New York City, because I was progressing on the clarinet. Probably, I'm sure I would not have been able to do that unless I had that background.
Right, right. And just on a technical level, and let's just use the clarinet because it was the instrument that you're talking about now. How did that translate? We referenced this a few minutes ago. How did it translate to actually helping your saxophone playing? Can you make that connection?
I think that the clarinet technically, it was such a hard thing to step back, but I think technically it's very difficult. When that's all you know, it didn't really seem that way, but technically speaking, it's a harder instrument to play. It's some basic technical things that haven't changed on a clarinet. On the clarinet, you have to cover the holes, so that does make you inherently kind of more efficient as far as how your fingers work. I think that saxophone players who don't have clarinet background can fall into a habit of slapping the keys only because it's technically possible to do. That really can wear thin, especially if you want to progress to a level of higher competence. It really, your hands can't handle all that kind of motion. It's like a pianist who doesn't have good technique. You can have all the musicality if you want, but your body is the machine that has to sustain all that stuff. And the older you get, the harder it gets. You got to be as efficient as you possibly can be. And I know that playing the clarinet without understanding it, it's just to be able to play it, you have to be efficient in the way that you move your hands. So I know that really helped me.
Right.
And the way you blow the instrument, of course, is big too. And for me, realizing that even though the clarinet and the saxophone are both single reed instruments, they're almost diametrically opposed as to the way you put air into the instrument. And if you don't understand that, you end up playing the saxophone in a way that's kind of stiff and won't sound idiomatic. A saxophone player who's in the walks of life that where we walked has to be able to play in a quote classical vein on the saxophone, and also in a way that doesn't sound so classical. And the history of the saxophone it's pretty interesting when you study the virtuosos that came way before us, like the guys in the Whiteman band, for instance. I mean, those guys weren't thinking about, jazz versus classical. They were just playing the instrument.
Right.
And it wasn't really until decades later, and this is where I think that conceptually people get very confused. And, this gets back to the conversation that we used to have with Lawrence Feldman, who's one of the, maybe the preeminent doubler of our generation, when he learned that if you try and sound too jazzy, there's no such thing as that. It's just basically inappropriate. So we've all heard examples of people who try and sound jazzy, but it's incorrect. And when you play the saxophone, if you're blowing into the saxophone like you would blow into a clarinet, it's literally incorrect. So, it's overly simplistic, but the clarinet is basically straight up and down, and the saxophone is almost perpendicular. So you can look at it that way. I think it helps to have even if it's not a perfect dichotomy, but it's certainly better to understand it that way than to try and approach both the saxophone mouthpiece and clarinet mouthpiece in the same way, because that just literally is incorrect, doesn't work.
Yeah, the similarities and the differences are needed to be understood physically as well as mentally. And the idea, for instance, we hear this a lot when you see people who are trained in concert saxophone, classical saxophone, try to play in a jazz idiom who don't have the background, or a clarinet player in an orchestra suddenly picks up and he has to play the saxophone, even in a classical scenario where they might have to move over and play a bolero or pictures at an exhibition, and it sounds not like a saxophone.
The typical thing is to overcompensate, and that's where you get into the problem of sounding literally just incorrect or inappropriate.
Right.
So the saxophone has evolved in such a way that there are these different stylistic there are different styles of saxophone playing, really, and then there are in clarinet playing too.
Yes.
So I guess until we understand where they intersect and where they diverge, it's pretty hard to understand where to fit in.
Right. Let's go back to another subject that you referenced, and that is certainly important because now you have 20 CDs or 20 albums as a leader, and a great deal of the material on all of these albums are originals. So, as a composer and arranger, how did you evolve in that? Did you study composition, jazz arranging at Eastman? How did you get more into that as your solo career emerged?
I always loved the idea of writing music. Even when I was a kid, I would write out music for myself to play on the piano. I didn't really understand chord changes until I got to college. I didn't understand I never studied composition in that way. I certainly studied arranging, but arranging when I was in school was kind of based on big band arranging, which was excellent information for me, but I never have had a knack for that. I began to compose just kind of for myself in a quartet setting, and that did work. I think it comes back to my propensity for organization. I kind of count myself as a kind of a junior OCD guy, and that I have a very particular I don't want to say obsession, but maybe obsession's okay, about parts being clear and easy to read. I don't think that people understand. My band often pokes fun of me. Don't show me parts that aren't taped together. If the part's not taped together, you're just asking for trouble, because one of the pages is going to fall off and you're going to get lost. So, I mean, what good is it? I mean, how good is the material if you can't read it? So the way the part is copied to me, I don't want to see a part where the bad page turn. I want my sidemen to have absolutely no issues with being able to see what's on the page and be able to play it immediately. And you learn in our profession, when you see a bad part, immediately it's a red flag. Who copied this part? Right. Something that I think that a lot of people don't get when I'm teaching, when I'm consulted. If a musician is not using notation software, I just don't understand it. It's like not having a telephone. Why would you attempt to be in a certain walk of life without the tools? So even though we grew up when you had to write with pencil and paper, you gotta be able to adapt. So when I was in my early 20s, of course, I was very kind of meticulous about copying parts, which of course for years I did with pen and paper. When notation software came along, I was all over it. I wanted that, and I consider that a huge resource. But I was always, I think intuitively, I knew that. I'll say this in present day as well. For someone like me to play a standard or a jazz tune, I don't really see it. It's much more typical when you think about all the players we look up to, they all have written their own music to perform. You can't think of very many players who have made a mark that haven't written their own music, even if they're not known as composers.
Yeah, I think the only one that comes immediately to mind is Stan Getz.
Dan Getz is unusual. That's the example I always give. He's obviously an unusual genius.
Yes.
Of course, there are other examples, but by and large, even musicians that we don't particularly think of as jazz composers, they all wrote their own music. And if they played another tune or a standard, it was in a particular way. And of course, arranging is writing. So I was always interested in writing because I wanted to perform in that context. I wanted to perform as a leader in a jazz quartet. And later, of course, I wrote for some other, 5, 6, 8, 9 horns, and kind of brought my, for whatever it's worth, multi experience playing other instruments and understanding what sounds good on other instruments. But I never really got way into the whole large ensemble thing. For me, it was all about writing for myself as a leader.
I think it would be a good time now to have the audience hear you playing in context in a club one of your original tunes, Coat of Arms, which was recorded a few years ago at Smalls, pre-pandemic. And just a couple of minutes, and I think everyone will get a kick out of this. So this is Walt's tune, Coat of Arms, at Smalls Club in New York City in the Village. I think it's 2019, I believe.
It's March of 19.
March, okay. All right, here we go. Let's get back to now more recent times. You established yourself in New York. You were starting to record as a soloist, leader, working shows and commercial gigs. And then early in the millennium, I believe it's right around the millennium, is when you got the call for Steely Dan. It's certainly been over 20 years, right?
I think it's 20 years this year that I made their record, Everything Must Go.
Right.
So in 2002, they were working on Everything Must Go.
Right.
And I was called in to do some horn section work.
Right.
Which was terrific. I was thrilled. And it never really at that time occurred to me that maybe they were checking me out, possibly for future reference. And later on in the year, I had the opportunity to go in and play on that title tune as kind of a tenor feature. lots of people don't know that both Donald Fagen and Walter Becker are huge jazz fans. I mean, they were going in to see, Roland Kirk play at the Vanguard when, we were learning how to play the clarinet in the 4th grade. So, I mean, they're both huge, real educated jazz fans.
And have always used some of the greatest saxophone players on the recordings. I mean, Phil Woods, Tom Scott, Pete Chrisley, Chris Potter. I mean, on and on. The list of Dwayne Shorter. I mean, the list of great saxophone players who've been featured with them over the years.
And great musicians. I mean, for them, I mean, knowing them as, well, of course, Walter passed in 2017, but after working with them, I look back on when they had those guys on their records, and for them, they were like kids in a candy store. Let's call Phil Woods. I mean, this is going to be great. for them, these are people that they knew. All these players were people that they had looked up to. To me, Marvin Stan was about 10 years older than those guys were. And Donald was just thrilled to have Marvin Stan on his solo records, just because he looked up to him when he was a kid.
Sure. Well, what a great story, and how fortunate for so many jazz players that pop artists, and composers of that stature held jazz artists in that. They're unique in that sense. A lot of pop musicians don't really get jazz, and they certainly did, which I think you can use maybe just as argue for vindication that kind of substance really does stand the test of time. That's one reason I am convinced that music has endured and will continue to endure, because it's substantive. Right. Now, yet it definitely has different rhythmic grooves than one is accustomed to in typical or even atypical jazz settings. So how did you, as a jazz artist, adapt to coming into playing this music and playing in the horn section? Were you someone who listened to a lot of this music, or a lot of pop music, R&B music prior?
No, I did not. When I was in high school, I knew the name Steely Dan. Of course, I knew that Asia was a big record when I was in college. But I was so focused on jazz, I never saw myself as a sideman in that context. So I didn't struggle from the standpoint of adaptation, only because I think that their model was perfect for someone like me. I had all the experience as far as playing in the section, so for me that was natural. And I suppose, on hindsight, that when they worked with me playing in a section and saw that I had zero issue, I wasn't trying to have my sound heard above others in the section. That's 90% of the job, is playing the section parts. But yet that I was a jazz player. That was the big thing for me, playing with those guys. When I hear myself on early live recordings, is playing too many notes, because in large venues it does not get across. It's not like the clip you played, Coat of Arms. Notes like that in a big arena are just, you're never going to hear it.
Right.
So through the years, I gradually learned how to kind of moderate and modify my playing, which I think for me also, that's been a very good thing, because I do kind of tend toward the eighth note. I mean, that's kind of the building block in jazz. But while it's necessary and great to have those skills, when you're playing more in a pop vein, you got to adapt, really play melodically, and use your skills and your musicality to make that transition, which is what I think I've learned how to do, and I still try and get better at it.
Great advice, Walt, and something I think musicians, as they get older, find out in some way way, shape, or form. But also interesting about mentioning how you might cater your playing, especially solo playing, depending on the venue you're in, the size of the venue, the not only the acoustics, but just the sheer size. I mean, instead of playing for a club where you might have 50 or 100 people or so forth, now you're playing for 20,000. 30,000 people. That's a different ball game, and that's.
I still think about that. I think you really, if you're tone deaf, as it were, to that kind of. I was just in Europe, and the last concert we played on tour, I could tell that the audience was older folks, and I just knew. I said we got to adjust our program, and so a couple different tunes, maybe not quite as much, got to kind of break them into the fast tempos rather than just kind of hit them with it all at once. And you got to be sensitive to that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I learned that from all the great leaders when I worked with Buddy Rich. If he didn't feel he had the crowd, he wasn't happy. Donald Fagen too. I mean, if he feels like the crowd is not with him, he gets it. He knows. He's very sensitive to that. And I mean, I've learned, obviously, you're not in a vacuum. You're supposed to be entertaining. People are supposed to be having fun, whether it's jazz in a club or a big pop band in an arena. People are supposed to be entertained.
Right. Great point. Let's diverge just a little bit and talk about your practice routine, because I want to talk about your books and your work in the Masterclass series that we're going to talk about in a little while. But let's start that off with how you approach practicing, because I think that will naturally lead to these other discussions.
Sure. Well, practicing for me at this stage of my life is different than it was. I think virtually all the books that I wrote, I never set out to write books. I just decided that, again, this might harken back to my kind of efficiency complex. When I was working on a certain technique or a certain approach, I decided, maybe intuitively, I should write this stuff down. This might come in handy at some point. And when I was working on Coltrane changes in my 20s, I began to write that stuff down. And
Coltrane book.
Fortunately, my friend and then colleague, my teacher, Ray Ricker, was kind enough to mentor me and partner me, and we partnered on those two books. And actually, when I decided that I wanted to write Intervallic Improvisation, which was the third book that I wrote, he cut me loose. He said, I think it's time you do this on your own. And he was exactly right, because the substance was all mine. And at that point, he had given me what he could of his skill in laying out, organizing, and presenting material. And for me, that was exactly what I needed. I needed to do that on my own. A lot of that had to do with not just the material, but how to get a computer and how to learn notation software. And that was all part of the process.
Right.
So really, without exception, all the stuff that I have written down that's now in the form of a book is all stuff that I practiced myself and was my way of organizing my practice.
And in knowing a number of your books and deciphering them, it's very clear that your knowledge of theory, not only jazz theory, but theory in general, is quite extensive. And that...
I fooled you again.
Well, if you
I was a terrible student. When I was in
more
college,
advanced than I am.
I learned actually very gradually. It's a good thing that I had a college education, because I was a very reluctant student. But theory is there for a reason. It's because it helps us understand that there's a reason why things sound good in the context of the Western music 12-note system.
No question.
Things that are theoretically sound good.
Right. In recent educational endeavors that you're involved with a wonderful online series that we're going to talk about called mymusicmasterclass.com, uh, you spend time really explaining how to apply theory, scales, intervals to evolving a maybe a little more personal, different, a unique way of playing, yet one that's grounded in the harmonic and melodic aspects of a tune. So why don't we just jump to that now? This is a little promo clip for Walt's Masterclass series that's presented on mymusicmasterclass.com, a wonderful website, which we'll talk about after the clip. And the tune that Walt is discussing in this is What Is This Thing Called Love? So mymusicmasterclass.com with Walt Weiskopf on What Is This Thing Called Love?
We're going to look at one of the absolute great tunes by Cole Porter called What Is This Thing Called Love? The first 4 bars of each A section begin with a minor 2-5 that tonicizes the minor 4 chord, which is unusual. And maybe that's part of the reason that the tune holds so much interest for us as jazz players. It works out very neatly that the minor 4 chord, if we think of melodic minor, if you consider the 6th mode of that scale, that's our scale on our mode for the 2 chord, D half diminished, of the tune. G7 is often notated with a sharp 5 because of the melody note. That note becomes the 9th of the tritone substitution D flat 9. I wrote a contrafact in concert B flat.
So Walt, you referenced that you just came off the road. Let's talk about your latest CD, Introspection, and the group you're doing, and a little about it. I also want to just let the audience know that the music they heard right up at the very front end before our interview began, and the music they're going to be hearing at the very end of our interview is from that CD.
Yeah, it was a very gratifying project because the first half we recorded in February of 2020, right before the pandemic. Matter of fact, I barely made it home before they closed the borders. And so we had 6 tunes, which were released that spring. But the intention was to record the next half of the record when we toured the next year, which of course didn't happen. So that brings me to my whole other pandemic project, which was how to record myself at home, which lots of other of our colleagues have been doing for years, particularly in the LA studio world. You used to get paid extra for recording at home, and now everyone expects you to do it. So I had other friends who've been doing this. I always shunned it. I never wanted to bother. I just figured this is going to take away from my practice time. I know it's a black hole, but at the same time, I have a very good friend, terrific colleague, Mike Smith, who's been doing this. He was way ahead of the curve. He's had a studio in his house for 25 years. And every time I talked to him, he would ask me, why aren't you doing this? And I finally realized I have no answer because I've got nothing else to do. So why not try? And long story short, I hired a couple students to help me. I never met these guys face to face, but they've certainly given me a lot of help. And I learned enough to be able to execute the second half of this record remotely. So I had to lay everything out and structure work tracks that I played along with, and then send that to my colleagues in Europe. And they went in and recorded their parts, sent it back to me, and then I recorded my stuff over again. Another dimension of that project is I dug out my flutes and my clarinets again because I hadn't played those since I moved to Virginia, really. So I decided that I wanted to add that dimension to this particular project, which was a lot of fun. So it was gratifying that it all came together. So the second half of that record is a product of this remote, virtual, new recording situation.
Yeah.
So it was recorded in 3 different locations.
Yeah, New World. And you just toured with this group,
Yes.
I assume, with this music.
We've been playing this music for a couple of years. Actually, we played mostly this past tour was stuff that we recorded this time around. So it's always, by the time we go on the road, I'm looking toward the next project. So I'm editing now and working on sending to terrific engineer for mixing and mastering stuff that we recorded in Cologne in January.
Well, given what you talked about, I mean, you where you might have started recording your solo projects in 1988, 89, we're talking roughly 32, 33 years, and you have 20 CDs as a leader. That's really quite something. So you're always looking ahead, it seems, and always, trying to stay on top of things in that way to get your latest products out.
I guess I'm always thinking about how do I progress? It's not really as ivory tower as you think. It's more about, this is what I love to do, and if I'm going to keep my band interested, I cannot just keep playing the same 10 tunes night after night. Not to mention the market doesn't tolerate that. You have to have new material.
Right.
So it's basically just, this is the job. This is what I do, and my job is to produce. And part of my job is to write material for myself to play. So it's always about, as a matter of fact, I wrote 2 tunes on the train in Germany because I realized that in order to have enough for an album, I had a couple ideas where I brought them over and it just didn't work, and I had to really punt. And it's amazing what a deadline will do for your goal of having to produce. But I was able to do it, and I always keep a log of stuff that's maybe in progress on my computer, and I was able to come up with enough stuff to record.
Great. In wrapping up our discussion, I thought it might be good to look back a little bit on who were your musical heroes? Who did you look to as you were growing up, and who you still look to? Obviously, we know John Coltrane is a huge influence in your playing, but in addition to Train, can you talk about those heroes, and not only if it's jazz, if it's in other areas as well?
Sure. Well, I grew up listening to classical music because my father was a classical pianist, and he didn't have any idea about jazz, but he played at a pretty high level. I heard Chopin growing up, and he also played Broadway show tunes, never by ear, but he was a good sight reader. So I had that background. Jazz-wise, we mentioned this earlier, I had really good teachers, and it wasn't just saxophone players that I admired. I loved Miles Davis at a young age. Didn't really understand what it was that I was hearing, but it wasn't just that I loved him as a trumpet player. I loved the bands that he had. And little by little, I realized that it wasn't just this one, quintet with George Coleman and Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams and Ron Carter. That's the first quintet that I got to know. But of course, I learned about Wayne Shorter at a relatively young age, and I loved Keith Jarrett at a young age. I mean, I ended up with this record, Belonging. I don't even know how I chose it, because the cover was attractive to me, and I didn't understand that it was one of the most important records really in our world until some years later. That was a big influence for me. Stan Getz was a huge influence for me. Dexter Gordon was a huge influence. Charlie Parker, obviously, I transcribed Charlie Parker solos when I was 13, 14 years old, without even understanding what the chord changes were. I would just play it back and over and over again and write the notes down. So I'm
sorry to interrupt you, but transcription was always a part of your learning process. At 13
Absolutely.
and 14, you were doing it. You just did this on your own as something you felt you wanted to figure out.
Yeah, I think I'm not even sure I understood that word at that time. I just knew that I want to play these notes. I got to play them, and I can't memorize them. I need to write them down little by little. And that's what I did. So
right.
I didn't understand the harmony at the time. I didn't understand that he was playing, root, third, fifth, seventh. Maybe to a certain extent I did, but I was really kind of working in a vacuum a lot. But in addition, obviously, to the influence of saxophone players, I grew to love beautiful arrangements. And my formative, I ended up with all those CTI recordings that Don Sebesky arranged, and that's one of my big influences. Later on, I learned about Duke Pearson and what a huge resource all his work and composing and arranging was, what a contribution he made. And obviously Gil Evans, huge influence. So I guess I had these in tandem, wanting to get better as a saxophone player. And I also did have a real interest in a beautiful setting, how to compose and arrange.
And what if you had a desert island list of recordings to take with you? What would some of them be at the top of your list?
That's a good question. As a matter of fact, I thought about this just recently, because my friend and colleague Amy Shook asked me to recommend examples of jazz records with 2 or more horns, because she wanted to work on that for her own, her own growth, which you got to admire somebody who's at her level. And I did think about, there's infinite examples, but there's some great records. I grew up with Mode for Joe. I discovered that record, and that just blew my mind. So records that are Ready for Freddie. To me, that was a hugely formative record. A great example of a couple, let's see, the 3 horns on that record, but how different a medium that is from a quartet. So for me, that was hugely influential. Other records that later on I was introduced to, Idle Moments, the Grant Green record with Joe Henderson. That record is still on the top of my playlist. The second horn in that case, well, I guess in a way there's 3 voices: saxophone, guitar, and vibes. And I also learned, Grant Green is hugely influential for me. Just the way those records sound, records with Larry Young and the tunes that they played and the settings they played. I Wish You Love, the way he presents that tune. That was a huge influence for me.
And beautifully recorded. Beautifully.
Well, it's all, Rudy Van Gelder.
It's not just, it's, terribly.
That was a big influence. I've always been maybe that's why I was so drawn to the aspect of production, because I do have very meticulous. I didn't even realize this, I think, until I was older. But the issue of sound. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to get a cassette player in my car, and it kept warbling, and I just drove me crazy. Nobody else could tell. But that kind of stuff has always been. It's the quality of the sound. That's in a way, that's what took me so long to begin to appreciate older recordings, because I just couldn't get past the static and the imperfections of the recording.
Sure. And thankfully a lot of recordings today are being remastered, and some quite magnificently. So at least we can hear them digitally being remastered. And well, Walt, it's been a lot of fun catching up with you and getting to know a little, even all these years I've known you, even more about you now. And I'm so happy that you're still writing and touring and playing, and that you're not slowing down a bit. And of course, Steely Dan is back touring again, and that's great news for everyone as well.
Yes, it is.
And we'll look forward to your new projects, and of course throughout this video we're showing pictures of all your books and CDs, and I just hope people will also check out your Masterclass series, because it's really quite something, and I'm looking forward to learning more. So thanks, man.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really been just a real pleasure.
Well, thank you too, Walt, and stay well, and we'll hopefully have all the audience back for our next video in the Woodwind Legacy series. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.